It was December 19th, 1490. A castle in Rennes, Brittany. An 8-year-old girl stands in a stone chapel wearing a wedding dress. The gown is heavy. Too heavy for her small shoulders. Gold thread runs through white silk. Pearls hang from her neck. Her hands shake. Not from cold. From fear. She is about to marry a man she has never met. A man who is not even in the room. Instead, a representative stands beside her. He holds a golden ring. He slips it onto her finger. The priest says the words. The girl nods. She is married now. Married to Maximilian of Habsburg, the future Holy Roman Emperor. But here's what will shock you. This wedding will not be her last. This man will not be her only husband. In fact, this 8-year-old girl will be married 4 times in her life, not to 4 different men, to the same political game, the same desperate fight for survival. The same impossible choice between freedom and destruction. Her name was Anne de Bretagne, and her story is the most absurd, heartbreaking, and powerful tale of medieval politics you have never heard. Did you catch that? 8 years old. Married to a man who was not even there. This was not a fairy tale. This was business. Cold, calculated, brutal business. Anne was not a princess in a tower waiting for rescue. She was the tower itself. The last piece standing between Brittany and complete annihilation. But who was Anne de Bretagne? Why did her wedding matter so much that kings would fight wars over it? The answer lies in geography. In 1490, France was not the France you know today. It was a patchwork of territories, duchies, counties, small kingdoms inside kingdoms. Most of them owed loyalty to the French king, but one did not. Brittany, small duchy on the western coast, rocky shores, dense forests, proud people who spoke their own language. Breton. Not French. They had their own laws, their own customs, their own duke, and they wanted to stay that way. But France wanted Brittany, wanted its ports, its tax revenue, its strategic position on the Atlantic. For decades, French kings had tried to absorb Brittany through diplomacy, marriage. War, nothing worked. The Bretons fought back. Again and again. Until 1488. That year, Anne's father Duke Francis II died. He left no sons. Only 2 daughters. Anne was the eldest. She was 11 years old. And suddenly, she was the Duchess of Brittany. The last obstacle between France and total control. Young girls do not rule duchies alone. Not in the 15th century. So Anne's advisors made a plan. They would marry her to someone powerful, someone who could protect Brittany from France, someone with armies, alliances, money. They chose Maximilian of Habsburg, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Austria, Burgundy, the Low Countries, one of the most powerful men in Europe. If Anne married Maximilian, Brittany would have imperial protection. France could not touch them, or so they thought. But there was a problem. Maximilian was in Austria, Anne was in Brittany, and France controlled everything in between. Maximilian could not travel to Brittany without starting a war. So they invented a solution, a proxy wedding. Maximilian would send a representative. The representative would stand in for him during the ceremony, would place the ring on Anne's finger, would speak the vows on Maximilian's behalf, and legally, religiously, politically, it would count as a real marriage. Absurd, absolutely, but it happened. December 19th, 1490, the chapel in Rennes, the 8-year-old girl, the golden ring, the absent groom. Anne de Bretagne was now married to Maximilian of Habsburg. The treaty was signed. Brittany was safe. Except it was not safe at all. France exploded with rage. King Charles VIII had been planning to marry Anne himself, to absorb Brittany through marriage instead of war. Now she belonged to his greatest rival. This was not just an insult. It was a declaration. Charles gathered his armies. 40,000 soldiers, cannons, siege equipment, They marched into Brittany. City after city surrendered. Castles fell. By November 1491, Anne was trapped in Rennes, surrounded. No food, no reinforcements, no husband coming to save her. Maximilian sent letters, promises, but no armies. The Holy Roman Emperor was fighting wars in Hungary. He could not spare troops for Brittany. Anne was alone, 14 years old, Duchess of a dying duchy, and outside her walls. The French king waited. Charles sent a message, "Marry me, or I will burn Rennes to the ground." Anne had a choice, surrender her body, or surrender her people. She chose her people. On December 6, 1491, Anne de Bretagne married Charles VIII of France. Her second wedding. She was 14 years old. But wait, you are thinking, she was already married to Maximilian. How could she marry Charles? Good question. The answer is simple. The Pope said so. Pope Innocent VIII declared Anne's marriage to Maximilian invalid. Why? Because Maximilian had not consummated the marriage. He had never even met Anne. Therefore, in the eyes of the Church, they were not truly married. Convenient, is it not? When the most powerful king in Europe wants something, the Church finds a way. Anne had no choice. No army, no allies, no escape. She signed the contract. But this was not just a wedding contract. This was a treaty. And the terms were brutal. If Anne died before Charles, Brittany would pass to France. If Charles died before Anne, she would marry the next French king, whoever that might be. Read that again. Anne agreed that if her husband died, she would automatically marry his successor. She was signing away not just her present, but her future, her freedom, her body, everything. Why would she agree to this? Because the alternative was watching her people starve, watching Rennes burn, watching Brittany disappear into mass graves and smoking ruins. So she said yes. She put on another wedding dress. She walked down another aisle. She married another man, her second husband, and this time, he was actually in the room. Anne de Bretagne was now Queen of France. 14 years old. Married to a man she barely knew. Living in a foreign court where everyone spoke a language she had learned to survive, not to love. But Anne was not broken. She was calculating. She understood something that Charles did not. He needed her more than she needed him. Brittany was still hers. By law. By blood. By the loyalty of her people. Charles could call himself Duke of Brittany, but the Bretons did not bow to him. They bowed to Anne. So she made demands. She kept her own household, her own advisors, her own income from Breton taxes. She wore the ducal crown of Brittany at every ceremony, right beside the crown of France. Charles allowed it. Why? Because Anne had one job, one purpose. Give him a son, an heir to unite France and Brittany forever. She tried. God knows she tried. Between 1492 and 1498, Anne was pregnant 7 times. 7 times her body swelled. 7 times she endured the agony of medieval childbirth. 7 times she prayed for a living son. 3 children were stillborn. 3 died within weeks. 1 survived. A son named Charles Orland. Born October 11, 1492. The entire kingdom celebrated. Cannons fired. Bells rang. Prayers of thanksgiving echoed through every cathedral in France. Finally, an heir. Finally, the future was secure. Charles Orland died December 16, 1495. He was 3 years old. Anne held his body. She did not cry in public. Queens do not cry in public. But in her private chambers, she screamed. She had given France 7 pregnancies. 7 waves of pain and hope and terror. And she had nothing. No living son. No security. No guarantee that any of it mattered. Then something happened that changed everything. April 7, 1498. King Charles VIII was walking through Amboise Castle. He was on his way to watch a tennis match, a game. A normal afternoon. He walked through a doorway. The door frame was low. Charles was tall. He hit his head, not hard. Just a bump. He laughed. Kept walking. Watched the tennis match. Then he collapsed. 9 hours later, he was dead. A king died from hitting his head on a door frame. Think about that. All the wars. All the battles. All the political schemes. And Charles VIII died because he was not paying attention to where he was walking. Absurd, tragic, darkly funny. But for Anne, it was something else. It was liberation. Charles was dead. She was 21 years old, free. Finally free. Or so she thought for about 6 seconds. Because then someone reminded her of the contract. The treaty she signed in 1491. If Charles dies before Anne, she will marry the next French king. The contract was clear. Anne was not free. She was inventory. Asset to be transferred from one king to the next. And the next king was already chosen. Louis XII, Duke of Orleans. Charles's cousin. 40 years old, balding, suffering from gout. And oh yes, already married. To Jean of France. Charles's sister. A woman with a spinal deformity who could not have children. Louis had been trying to annul that marriage for years. Now, he had motivation. Louis went to Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, a man famous for selling anything if the price was right. Louis made his case. His marriage to Jean was invalid. Why? Because it had been forced. Because Jean could not consummate it properly due to her physical condition. Because he needed an heir and she could not provide one. The Pope listened. The Pope considered. The Pope accepted a large donation to the church. On December 17, 1498, Louis's marriage to Jean was annulled. Erased. As if it never happened. Jean was devastated. She had loved Louis. She begged him not to abandon her. He ignored her. He had a kingdom to secure. And that required Anne de Bretagne. But here is where Anne showed her power. She was not the terrified 14-year-old girl anymore. She was a queen. A duchess. A woman who understood how this game worked. Louis needed her. Needed Brittany. Needed the legitimacy she provided. So Anne made him negotiate. She drew up a new marriage contract. And this time, the terms were hers. If Louis died before Anne, Brittany would remain independent. It would pass to Anne's daughters, not to France. Anne would keep her own household, her own advisors, her own authority as Duchess. She would be crowned separately as both Queen of France and Duchess of Brittany. To crowns. To ceremonies. To sources of power. Louis agreed. He had no choice. On January 8, 1499, Anne de Bretagne married Louis XII of France. Her third wedding. Her second French king. Same throne. Different man. Same contract of survival. Life with Louis was different from life with Charles. Louis was older, calmer. He respected Anne's intelligence. He consulted her on political matters. He allowed her to govern Brittany directly. They were not passionate lovers. But they were partners, allies. To people trapped in the same system, trying to make it work. And once again, Anne's body became a battlefield. Between 1499 and 1510, Anne was pregnant 5 more times. 5 more cycles of hope and grief. 2 daughters survived. Claude, born October 13, 1500. Renee, born October 25, 1510. 12 pregnancies total in Anne's life. 12 times her body was used as a vessel for political futures. 10 children died. 2 lived. Both daughters. No sons. France still had no direct heir from Anne de Bretagne. But Anne had something more valuable than sons. She had Claude, her oldest daughter, the heir to Brittany. And Anne was determined that Claude would not suffer the same fate, would not be sold to the highest bidder at age 8, would not spend her life as a political token, and made plans. Secret plans. She would marry Claude to Charles of Austria, grandson of Maximilian. Remember him? Anne's first husband who never showed up. This was poetic justice. Anne's daughter would marry into the Habsburg line. Brittany would be protected by the Holy Roman Empire. France could not touch them. Louis did not know about these plans. Or if he did, he said nothing. He was getting old, tired, sick. The gout was spreading. He could barely walk. And Anne was planning for a future after Louis. A future where Brittany would finally be free. But the problem with plans is that they require time. And time was running out. On January 9, 1514, Anne de Bretagne collapsed. She had been feeling ill for weeks. Fever. Weakness. Pain in her abdomen. She took to her bed. Priests were called. Doctors bled her. Applied leeches. Prayed. Nothing worked. And knew she was dying. She called for Claude. Her daughter was 13 years old. The same age Anne had been when she married Charles. Anne held Claude's hand. She told her about Brittany. About the language. The people. The green hills and rocky coasts. About the responsibility of being Duchess. About strength. About survival. About never surrendering who you are, no matter who tries to take it from you. On January 9, 1514, Anne de Bretagne died. She was 36 years old. She had been Queen of France twice. Duchess of Brittany her entire life. Wife 3 times. Mother 12 times. And she died believing she had secured Brittany's future through Claude. She was wrong, because there was a 4th wedding coming, and this one would destroy everything Anne had fought for, and was dead. But her contract was not. The treaty she signed with Louis stated clearly that Brittany would pass to her daughters. To Claude, the 13-year-old girl who now held the fate of an entire duchy in her hands. Louis was still alive. Still king. But he was 52 years old and dying slowly. His gout had spread to his kidneys. He could barely stand. He had no son. No direct heir. Which meant the crown of France would pass to his cousin, Francis of Angoulême. A young man. 20 years old. Handsome. Athletic. Ambitious. And absolutely determined to absorb Brittany into France once and for all. Francis understood something that previous French kings had missed. You cannot force Brittany into submission through war. And had proven that. Her people would resist forever. But you can trick Brittany into surrendering. And the trick was simple. Marry Claude. If Francis married Claude, he would become Duke of Brittany through marriage. Not by conquest. Not by force. By legal right. And when Louis died, Francis would be both King of France and Duke of Brittany. 2 titles. 1 man. 1 kingdom. Brittany would disappear. Not in fire and blood, but in wedding vows and inheritance law. Louis knew this. He had promised Anne on her deathbed that Claude would marry Charles of Austria. That Brittany would remain independent. But Louis was dying. And Francis was persistent. He visited Louis every day. Reminded him that France needed stability. That a Habsburg marriage would mean war. That Claude deserved to stay in France, close to home, close to her sister Renée. Louis resisted for months. He remembered Anne's wishes. He remembered his promise. But Francis wore him down. And on May 18, 1514, just 4 months after Anne's death, Louis gave his approval. Claude would marry Frances. The fourth wedding. Not Anne's wedding this time. But it might as well have been. Because Claude was Anne's creation. Anne's hope. Anne's final attempt to save Brittany. And now that hope was being sold to the very kingdom Anne had spent her life resisting. The wedding took place on May 18, 1515. Claude was 14 years old. The same age Anne had been when she married Charles. Frances was 21. The ceremony was magnificent. Gold everywhere. Silk banners. Hundreds of nobles. The Pope sent his blessing. Everyone celebrated. Everyone except the Bretons. They watched in silence. They knew what this meant. Their Duchess was now Queen of France. And her husband was a Frenchman, a Valois. The enemy. Claude tried to honor her mother's memory. She insisted on being crowned separately as Duchess of Brittany. She kept Breton advisors. She spoke Breton at court when she could. But she was not Anne. She was softer, gentler. Trained from birth to obey. And Francis knew it. He smiled. He called her his beloved wife. He gave her jewels and gowns and empty compliments. And behind her back, he planned. On January 1, 1515, King Louis XII died. Francis became King Francis I. And Claude became Queen of France. She was 15 years old. She had everything. 2 crowns. A young husband. The adoration of 2 kingdoms. And she had nothing. Because Francis was already moving. On August 13, 1532, 18 years after Anne's death, Francis issued a royal decree. The Duchy of Brittany was officially annexed into the Kingdom of France. No longer a separate territory. No longer semi-independent. Just another province. The Breton language would be discouraged. Breton laws would be replaced with French laws. Breton taxes would flow directly to Paris. Brittany ceased to exist as a political entity. And Claude? Claude said nothing. Did nothing. She had given Francis 7 children in 9 years. Her body was broken. She was exhausted. She had no strength left to fight. On July 26, 1524, Claude of France died. She was 24 years old. 8 years younger than her mother had been, used up, worn out, discarded. Francis remarried within a year. He barely mentioned Claude again. But he kept Brittany. Kept the ports. Kept the taxes. Kept everything Anne de Bretagne had died trying to protect. The fourth wedding had succeeded where 3 armies had failed. It had killed Brittany without firing a single shot. So why does Anne de Bretagne matter? Why should you care about a woman who died 500 years ago? Because Anne's story is not just about medieval politics. It is about what happens when human beings are treated as property. When women's bodies become battlefields. When contracts matter more than consent. Anne was married 4 times. Not because she wanted love. Not because she chose her partners. But because men with armies decided her body was the key to controlling land. She was 8 years old at her first wedding. 14 at her second. 21 at her third. And her daughter was 14 at the fourth. For generations of women. For weddings. For attempts to erase Brittany from the map. And here is the tragedy. They succeeded. Brittany is gone. Walk through Rennes today and you will see French street signs. French schools. French language everywhere. The Breton language survives only in small pockets. Mostly among old people who remember when their grandparents spoke it. The culture has faded. The independence has vanished. And lost. Or did she? Because 500 years later, we are still talking about her. Still saying her name. Still remembering the woman who was married 4 times and never surrendered. Anne de Bretagne left behind more than political failure. She left behind art, architecture, manuscripts. She was one of the great patrons of the French Renaissance. She commissioned books, dozens of them, illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf and detailed illustrations. She hired the best artists in Europe. She filled her libraries with texts in Latin, French, Italian, Greek. She believed that culture was resistance, that beauty was defiance, that if she could not save Brittany through armies, she would save it through memory. Her tomb is in Saint Denis Basilica near Paris. White marble, incredibly detailed. Her face is calm, peaceful. Her hands folded in prayer. Carved around the base are symbols of Brittany. The ermine, the Duchess's crown, the coat of arms. Even in death, she insisted on being remembered as Breton. Not just French. Never just French. Visitors still come to see her tomb. They leave flowers. They whisper prayers. They remember the girl who was married for times to save one thing, freedom. The contracts failed. The treaties were broken. The promises were lies. But her spirit never surrendered. And maybe that is enough. Maybe resistance does not always look like victory. Maybe sometimes it looks like a woman in a marble tomb, still wearing her Breton crown 500 years after everyone told her to give it up. The next time you see a wedding, remember Anne. Remember that not every bride is there by choice. Not every ceremony is about love. Some weddings are treaties. Some marriages are wars fought with rings instead of swords. And some women spend their entire lives being bought and sold and transferred like property, and still manage to leave behind something beautiful. Something true. Something that says I was here, I mattered, I fought. Anne de Bretagne was married for times. And she lost. But we still say her name. We still tell her story. We still remember that once, there was a girl who refused to disappear. And in the end, maybe that is the only victory that matters. The one that outlasts empires. The one that survives long after kings and contracts turn to dust. If you found this story powerful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video so others can discover Anne's story. Subscribe to hear more forgotten voices from history. And remember, some ghosts are not meant to haunt, some are meant to inspire. Anne de Bretagne fought for 36 years, and 500 years later, we are still fighting alongside her.